Here we are in St Laurence's Church, Chorley, and in normal times there would have been a physical exhibition here depicting the life of Myles Standish. Now, what we are going to have is a virtual exhibition and this video to go along to explain what the exhibition is about. We don't know a great deal about Myles Standish. Born anywhere between 1583 and 1587, experienced as a soldier in the Netherlands with the English army, but shot into fame through being the military advisor with the Pilgrim Fathers who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620. He himself settled in what became America. He died in 1656, and his will of 1655 is really important. Now, there are many issues about Myles Standish, and the first one is, where did he hail from? Where was he born? Who was his family? And we're starting in St Laurence's because here we have a Standish pew. And it's the Standish of Duxbury pew, put in about 1600 by Alexander Standish of Duxbury. And what's really interesting is that in 1632, Myles moved away from New Plymouth and set up his own farm and his own settlement at Duxbury in New England, and he called that Duxbury. Well, he must have done that for a reason. So the people of Chorley and St Laurence's in particular do feel an association with Myles Standish. Here, for example, you see an art competition mooted by the Friends of St Laurence's Chorley, and there is a depiction of the Mayflower on its voyage in 1620, 400 years ago. This is the old 15th century chancel of St Laurence's Chorley, and in that chancel you have the monuments to the Standish family of Duxbury. Thing was, though, in 1812, the last of the real Standishes of Duxbury, Sir Frank, died in London, and then it was a question of finding cousins who might have a claim to the estate. First of all, there was Frank Standish, who came from Durham in 1812, and then in 1840, when he died, it was a gentleman called William Carr of Cocken Hall near Durham who came. Very wisely, he took upon himself to have new names, call himself William Standish. But some people thought that, well, perhaps this wasn't quite right, and there were lots of other claimants to the Duxbury estate at that time. And one man came from America, a man called Mr. Bromley in 1846, and he was representing descendants of Myles Standish in America. And not surprisingly, they were very keen to claim a share of the 6,000-acre Duxbury estate. Now, he visited this church in 1846 and demanded to see the parish registers. And on looking at the parish registers, he found that for 1583-84 there were several pages defaced. One in particular, it looked very much like the cleric of the time had been using a pumice stone to give himself some extra space, or new space, to write some records on. But Mr. Bromley claimed that Myles Standish's birth had been rubbed out, Myles Standish's baptism had been rubbed out, because people at the time were surreptitiously detaining his estates. And we'll hear more about surreptitiously detaining shortly. Now we're at Duxbury Hall, Chorley. Well, we could say where Duxbury Hall was, because as you look at the lawns in front of us, we're right bang middle in where the hall stood. The stable building with the cupola on top, you can see probably from about 1780. And behind there, behind the high wall, is the old barn, which was the first building at Duxbury from just before 1600. And this was the home of the Standishes of Duxbury. Remember, Myles named his own settlement in America Duxbury. I wonder, he came back to England to try and raise money for the Pilgrim Fathers in 1625. And we have a stone from a build of the Duxbury Hall dated 1623. I wonder if he heard about that, and I wonder if he thought, well, yeah, my antecedents might well be the Standishes of Duxbury Hall. So a last look at the stable block at Duxbury Hall, Chorley. Thing is, Myles could have been related to the Standishes of Duxbury, but there were 6 branches of the Standish family, at least 6 branches locally. And Myles caused some confusion because in his will of 1655 he didn't refer to Duxbury at all. I'll read you his will. It gives us some clues. I give unto my son and heir apparent, Alexander Standish, all my lands as heir apparent by lawful descent in Ormistick, Boscoyne, Wrightington, Maudsley, Newborough, Croston, and the Isle of Man, and given to me as the right heir by lawful descent, but surreptitiously detained from me, my great-grandfather being a second or younger brother from the house of Standish, March the 7th, 1655, by me, Myles Standish. Moved away from Duxbury now, because I did say there were certainly about 6 local branches of the Standish family. Now, if you remember the will we've just read out, Myles was adamant in 1655 that he was from the house of Standish. And the building we've looked at, Lower Burgh Hall here, belonged to a branch of the Standish family of Lower Burgh. And actually, some of the founders of that family would certainly feature as being a second or younger brother from the house of Standish, so that would fit another reference in the will. So the Standishes of the Lower Burgh could well be the family that Myles was related to. An interesting thing about the Lower Burgh Hall that you see, that it is one of the, well, perhaps the only building actually left standing in Chorley that dates back to the time that Myles Standish might have been born. That is apart from St Laurence's Church. This is the beautiful perpendicular Standish Parish Church. Say perpendicular, it's actually built 1585, roughly about the time, of course, that Myles Standish was born. And he was absolutely adamant, I am a Standish of Standish. And of course, Standish inevitably was the mother and father of all the other Standish families and estates round about. And we can find a second or younger son who could have been his great-grandfather if we look at the time scale, around about 1500. We also find lots of Alexanders in the Standish family tree. And Myles himself named his, not his first son, but his surviving first son, Alexander. So was he in fact a Standish of the root branches of the Standish? About a mile and a half from St Wilfrid's Church, Standish, is Standish Hall Farm. So called because it stands next to where Standish Hall itself was, built in 1573. So Myles, if he was from these parts, would probably know it. The last of the Standishes of Standish died out in about 1820. The hall was into rent and eventually auction and was demolished in the 1980s. But it could have been the ancestral home of Myles Standish, because he was insistent in his will that he was a Standish of Standish. The final site we want to look at in relation to Myles' origins is the Isle of Man. Now this could be the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea, because a branch of the Standishes of Standishes was established from Ormskirk in Ellenbane in the Isle of Man. And it could just so be that Huan Standish of Ormskirk, and then the Isle of Man, was a younger son of the Standish of Standish, and that could be Myles' great-grandfather. There is a gap in the Isle of Man Standish records of an unnamed child, and it has been supposed that that was Myles. Unfortunately, it's much more likely to have been a young man named after his elder brother who had died. However, the nameplate that you're looking at now, the Isle of Man Farm, is not in the Irish Sea at all, but just west of Chorley and Standish, on the outskirts of Croston. And if I remind you that in his will, Myles mentioned that he was heir apparent to land in Ormskirk, Burscough, Wrightington, Maudsley, Newborough, Croston and the Isle of Man. Well, this could be the Isle of Man that he was referring to. Standish of Ormskirk lands, all fairly well listed in Myles' account. Turning away from the Isle of Man Farm nameplate and looking in the opposite direction, you get some idea why the farm was named the Isle of Man, because after yesterday's heavy rain you can see a lake in front of us and the various bits of higher land, of which this is one, poking above the general landscape. We return to the 15th century chancel of St Laurence's Church, Chorley, after our tour of sites possibly linked to our hero Myles Standish. Was he a Standish of Duxbury? Because he called his settlement in America Duxbury, and the Standishes of Duxbury were associated with this church? Or was he, as he claimed, a direct Standish of Standish? Or just possibly a Standish of Ormskirk and the Isle of Man, whichever Isle of Man that may be. Finally, possibly a Standish of the Lower Burgh, who also were a branch of the Standish family. It's very hard to be definitive. There is some DNA evidence already. Myles' descendants contain a Y chromosome in their genetic makeup, which is unique to Lancashire. And a gentleman who can trace his family tree back to before 1700, a local gentleman, has had quite recently DNA tested against Standish descendants in America, and there is a 24 to 25 match. But which branch of the Standish family? If we delve beneath this crypt and did a DNA test on the Standishes of Duxbury and looked at that match, that would be fairly informative, or perhaps at St Wilfrid's in Standish. For the time being, we have to say we don't know. Possibly Myles himself did not know. Perhaps the fact that he seemed somewhat confusing when he referred to Duxbury and then in his will referred to Standish of Ormskirk lands and Standish of Standish, perhaps he was casting around a little unsure of his own origins, apart from the fact he found himself in a military camp in the Netherlands in the 1590s or early 1600s, and perhaps he was hoping for the best. Someday, somebody may come across a parish record, or there may be a definitive DNA test. That's for the future. So we have dealt with one of the main issues concerning Myles Standish, the whereabouts of his origins. There are two other issues that we are seeking to explore. First of all, just how able a leader was he amongst the Pilgrim Fathers and the settlers in America who went on the Mayflower in 1620. There is some criticism. For example, if he had taken the original search party for a site away from Cape Cod to the north or the west, he may well have founded a very prosperous settlement where Boston is today. But instead he chose to follow a southerly route round Cape Cod and came to a place that wasn't quite that desirable, which eventually the Pilgrims named New Plymouth. His first actions over there were not particularly praiseworthy in that he disturbed Indian almost burial grounds in order to get at stores and food. And he certainly disappointed some of the Mayflower contingent when in 1632 he left New Plymouth to go and found his own settlement in Duxbury. Having said that, they would have been hard pushed to do without him. He was their choice as military captain, and this was confirmed when they landed in America. And he was essential for giving the military training and the military dispositions that allowed this very small group of people to survive. He also proved a very courageous, honourable and convincing man when half of them went down with terrible fever in their very first winter in America. And he stood strong as a nurse, as a man who fetched supplies, as a man who was unbowed during that horrible time in which he lost his wife and many other people perished as well. After that, he featured in 1625, coming back to try and raise more money to support the settlement. He himself acted as assistant governor, as treasurer. He guaranteed their debt. And although he went to Duxbury, he remained a military advisor in some respect into the 1630s. So perhaps on balance, you would judge that he was a good servant of this fledgling settlement in America. The third issue that we are exploring, though, is a very serious one, particularly today, because of contemporary events in our own century. He is often criticised as being more than forthright, in fact vicious, towards the Native Americans that he encountered. There are two bases for this thesis, really. First of all, if you look at the crest of the flag of Massachusetts over the last 150 years, you will see the figure of a Native American, and above it you will see an arm poised with a sword. And it's often believed that this was modelled on the sword of Myles Standish, and that it's to depict settlers led by Myles Standish beating down upon the head of the Native Americans. In fact, the motto underneath the shield and the raised sword above the Native American were really taken from the time of the American Revolution, and it was a warning about defending liberty against the British government at the time. But it doesn't give Myles the best press, and it's sometimes assumed that the sword is modelled upon Myles' sword in the museum at New Plymouth. Secondly, he was guilty of one particular heinous, vicious, perhaps even cowardly attack upon a group of Native Americans. In 1623, the fledgling settlement at New Plymouth was threatened by action from Massachusetts Indians to the north of New Plymouth. And Myles himself had been insulted and threatened a number of times. Well, being Myles, he decided on preventative action and lured, with the promise of a feast, two important sachems of the Massachusetts groups into a meeting. And with the door locked, he then set upon them, killed one leader himself, and that day caused the death of 6 others. This is seen as being a particularly heinous event. If there is defence for that, one has to say that he was acting under orders from Governor Bradford of New Plymouth, but then again Myles was one of his strongest advisors, so perhaps it was he who put the policy in William Bradford's head. Secondly, he was used to defending a group of people who had been reduced from over 100 to just 50 people in their very first year, and there was a very good chance they would be pushed into the sea. After the 1622 killings in Virginia, where 347 people of European origin were wiped out by Native Americans, you could perhaps understand the concern in their mind. It's furthermore worth adding that the 7 deaths that Myles was responsible for perhaps can be put into proportion by talking about the 1637 depredations and killings done by other settlers in Massachusetts towards the Native Americans. And secondly, to compare that with what's known as King Philip's War in the 1670s, when countless Native Americans were sent into slavery, and of course Myles Standish had nothing to do with those much more thoroughgoing and terrible events. If it's any consolation too, I mean, he could be equally forthright and equally strong with anybody, and Thomas Morton, an Englishman settling at Merrymount to the north of New Plymouth, found him a very brusque arresting officer when he came to carry Morton away to his punishment. So it's up to people reading their history to make their judgments. I can recommend Philbrick's books on the inter-American wars at that time and the Pilgrims' role in that. And eventually the Pilgrims did become enmeshed in the politics of the region and the landed takeover that went on. But in their early days, they just sought to be small, separate, and to build a godly community. And we're grateful for Myles Standish to be their military helper, advisor. So there we have it. We wished we could give you a physical exhibition to go around and to talk to people and ask questions. For now, we rely on this video that we've put together to introduce the 3 main issues that the exhibition is addressing. Thank you very much.